Season's greetings from the crew here at Twitch. This week in computer hardware, well, we talk about hardware, and right now we got some of Twitch's best discussions and reviews from 2017. We're recapping a year full of modern wonders like the beautiful HDR monitors at CES, Corsair's Bulldog 2.0, AMD's Ryzen 7 processor. I love it so much. NVIDIA's Quadro GPU, the Radeon RX 580, the GTX 1080 Ti, SATA III, Intel's Core i9 lineup, Tobii Eye Tracking, Seasonic's 550-watt power supply, and the news of Intel CPUs with frickin' AMD Radeon graphics. It has been a wild ride this year, and you can catch up on it right now in our Best of 2017 recap episode.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Twitch is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 446, recorded for December 28th, 2017. End of the year wrap up, the biggest in PC hardware for 2017. This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by GoToWebinar, a trusted webinar platform with over 55,000 customers who have hosted over 2.7 million interactive web events to connect with their audiences. For more, visit gotowebinar.com/podcast. 2018 is just days away, and we're going to start with CES and all the mayhem that hardware brings to Las Vegas. And, of course, a whole year full of shows for you. This Week in Computer Hardware is going to track week by week the most important news in desktop, mobile, gaming, portable, and who knows what's going to happen in networking and the Internet of Things. You'll know if you're here at twit.tv/Twitch to join us on This Week in Computer Hardware. On behalf of Ryan Shrout and myself, thank you so much for listening and watching.
It has been one of the worst years for when we're going to ship it and what the price is going to be.
Yeah.
You know, whether you're talking about, LG's latest OLED TV, which was amazing, right? It's it's like 2.3 millimeters thick. It's all bleeding
like the
together
stick to the wall one that we're talking about here. Yeah. I didn't get to see it in person, but the photos I saw were impressive.
It's I got to see it in person, and I got to see it a second time. What's kind of funny is it's like they were doing this whole we're creating a totally immersive environment, and we needed to get to below 4 millimeters thickness to reduce shadows. And hold on, there's a payoff here. And they talk about all the OLED technology and how because they don't have the backlight, it can be so thin and it's glorious. And you mount this magnetic frame, and then you magnetically, the television is held up magnetically to the wall. But of course, they still need power and HDMI processing, which won't fit in a 2.3-inch monitor. So there's a cable that comes down and goes to this big sound bar that looks like it was designed by the guy who designed Kylo Ren's helmet, with a couple of Dolby Atmos pop-up speakers that come out of it. So you have this beautiful statement of elegance and immersion, and then you got a big old sound bar underneath it that you can't get rid of.
Was this the TV with the clear cable, or is that the Samsung?
The Samsung has a little fiber optic
this
cable.
Weird, semi-translucent cable, so it would blend in with any paint color on the wall you have. Somebody
decided. Somebody wrote what was kind of a cranky comment that apparently every HD TV manufacturer thinks we want television. I would think maybe Marcus Brownlee or somebody was basically talking how every television manufacturer seems to think we want thinner TVs, which, much like thinner phones, no one I know is actually asking
Yeah,
for.
no, I totally agree. Especially if you're mounting on the wall, the difference of 2 inches and 3 inches and 4 inches is really minimal.
Well, Samsung has a really cool mount for their new televisions that essentially they've created a sort of a pocket in the back of the television, and you can tip it forward or you can get it all the way back up against the wall. It's very slick and very clean as far as insulation goes.
That's a good idea.
I also saw a really wonderful pickup truck HD TV mount for tailgating parties.
That
so you
sounds
can
like a
carry
good
a
idea.
55-inch.
I'm a fan of that.
Television. I figured you would be. I'll send you the link to that one.
Did you see any of the new Asus stuff?
I have not gotten to the Asus booth yet.
So Asus has they've got 2 new phones. One with the 2 lens, kind of like the 7 Plus,
right? The VR phone,
and then they have the AR, AR phone, which is basically like the Lenovo Fab 2 Pro, kind of Google Tango plus Tango and Daydream support. So it'll do the AR, then you can put it in the Daydream headset, which the name is escaping me, for VR experience as well. On the consumer side, they and NVIDIA announced a new monitor, a 4K HDR 144 hertz, 4K 144 hertz, IPS, G-Sync screen.
and what kind of GPU are you going to need to feed that?
If you want, but you don't have to go up to 144 hertz, right?
Right.
So, it's a kind of.
If you have a monitor that goes up to 144 hertz, you should go up to 144.
You should try
hertz.
to get there.
What was the point of buying it?
But it's variable refresh, so anything in between is still going to be good.
Okay.
But it was kind of a silently. It's actually the launch of something called G-Sync HDR, which is brand new. Like, I had not heard of it before I got here, and they're just
basically
really
all the
talking
HDR monitors that didn't exist. And I was actually talking on Tech Thing last week. I'm like, okay, or the Tech Thing that launched like the first day of CES, where Dell had announced their new 27-inch HDR desktop monitor. I was like, this is going to be the first of many HDR desktop announcements.
Asus they announced like the PG27UQ, which is like their gaming ROG thing, and I saw that today at the NVIDIA suite, and it looked awesome. It was an amazing looking display, but of course no pricing, availability in Q2, and then Asus announced a professional series, a Pro Art one. I'm not going to try to remember the model number. It's a 32-inch 4K. 95% of P3 color space HDR panel, anywhere from $1,500 to $1,800 is what they're telling me. And again, a Q2 release, and like that's it. Like that's the next thing for me. After seeing, NVIDIA had a 4K G-Sync SDR and 4K G-Sync HDR side by side, running the same demos and playing it back in Unreal Engine 4, and it's jaw-droppingly different.
Really?
But the problem is, no camera, no matter how good it is, can display it on your normal display and show you the difference. It's the same thing with like 3D TVs and VR.
You ever talk about headphones?
Yes, that's a good point, right? Anything that is experienced, you can experience the difference, but you can't write it. You can't express it.
What was the most noticeable thing about the difference? Was it color? Was it a lack of smearing? Was it?
It's color. It's all about the ratio, right? Like there was a scene in the demo where like a fireball comes up a tunnel, right? And the brightness, and they would pause it, and like the brightness of the fireball is almost kind of like a blindingly, painfully bright. Right. It's 1,000 nits screen. On this guy, but in the same thing, the darkness off of the corner is still there, and all the detail is still there. And I think both that and the Asus one both the Asus Gaming and the Asus Pro have 384 backlight zones. So the adjustable backlight zones for it. So they're doing a good job of kind of keeping that contrast ratio wide.
It's been interesting to look because the new kind of QLED, the new Samsung LED flat panels are all edge lit. And they look, now obviously these are cherry picked panels at one of the most important events of the year for Samsung. Right. But I mean, I was talking to 2 or 3 people. Amazing. Nobody could see any variation, no bright spots, no dimming.
Alan saw it, and he was amazed by it as well. He was trying to take pictures of it with his camera, and like it was all
getting more and more
frustrated.
Shows up
banding.
Well, it's also
banding in the camera, right?
Right, because the camera can't actually do it. And what's crazy about Samsung's looking at some of the next generation, instead of like color spaces, looking at color volumes with the idea that because they are using. Because of the technology they're using in the panel, they are being able to at maximum, 1,500 nits at maximum brightness. Because basically it goes from 0 is black, bright. 1 is white, but they can get full saturated colors all the way up to maximum brightness when they turn everything, right before they turn everything white. And it's interesting to look at, right? Because, Samsung says they have the best, LG says they have the best. Sony dropped OLED Bravia 4K TV that everyone says looks absolutely spectacular.
The real problem is that there's no answer. Like there's no one answer, right? There's competing standards.
Well,
you've got
quantum.
HDR10,
the answer right now is almost everybody is going quantum dots, except for Hisense, who says that
both of these HDR
laser is really the answer, but that's not quite there for most stuff.
The question of color space, is still like everybody can do their own, and it's all going to be better than what we have. Right. And it's all about how do you map the content to it, whether it be video content or gaming content or anything like that. Right. You've got Rec 2020 being this 10-year plan. You've got P3 being a 5-year plan, and then Adobe sRGB or Adobe RGB being like we should be there today.
And then we have LG deciding that we need more confusion around HDR, so they're partnering with Technicolor to create Technicolor's HDR.
We don't need any more potential standards, and it's already confusing enough because
that's basically a checkbox
you're only hitting
feature,
a percentage of it,
and that they want to put on the side of the box. Like there's no practical application for that.
I do think that 2017 we'll see more HDR displays than I thought we were.
3D's
originally.
dead. Almost all
Yes.
4K displays, except for the bottom of the barrel ones, will include HDR this year. I mean,
Yes.
TCL came out with 25 Roku televisions, right? They're basically like, we have 25 televisions. Hisense is bringing their 100-inch short throw laser projector system to the
Right.
Anchor started a new brand to do home theater equipment. You know what I mean? It's like it's.
I saw that Fire TV had been integrated in some 4K TVs as well. That's a pretty cool feature.
Yeah.
NVIDIA announced the new Shield that does 4K HDR through Amazon, Netflix, YouTube, and another service that I'm blanking on right now as well. And it's impressive. When you go to these demo rooms and you see those TVs, I want to buy that, and then somebody tells you, well, maybe you want to hold off on buying this one because this next one's going to have the better integration of that standard, and that's kind of the frustrating part on displays.
The Corsair Bulldog, which is, depending on how you look at it, a home theater PC or gaming PC designed for 4K gaming. So is this the enclosure and the power supply, or was it a fully built system?
So this is a bare bones system. The for $399 you get the chassis, you get the motherboard pre-installed, you get the power supply pre-installed, and you get the cooler, the CPU cooler pre-installed minus, it's not attached to the motherboard yet. It's just the fan and radiator is mounted. So then you add the CPU, you add the memory, your storage, SSD or hard drive or both, and then you get a GPU, and you have a fully functioning system in there. And what's interesting about it is that the Bulldog system itself is this is version 2.0, but the main change is that they've used like PWM fans that are a little bit quieter when you're not gaming, when you're just idling or watching video or whatever. The system is definitely quieter. And then they upgraded from a Z170 board to a Z270 board. So the design of the chassis, you either liked it before or you didn't, and that's not going to change any at this point. If you think the physical look of it is ugly, then you're still going to think that's the case. If you still think that it looks good, and it also is really nice because it just kind of it's built to fit into that home theater PC infrastructure, then you're still going to feel that way about it there. It's definitely people hate it and people love it, right? And we'll leave the design side at that. But from a construction standpoint, it's actually pretty neatly constructed because you can still put full power, full size components in this, right? So if you watch the video we posted, we're using a Core i7 7700K part. We're using a water-cooled, like self-contained water-cooled GTX 1080 graphics card. It can fit up to 3 SSDs or 1 SSD and one hard drive in it. And it all works really well. And I mean, and it's, we talk about home theater PC designs quite a bit, but a lot of times you have restrictions on what kind of hardware you can use and that type of stuff. And Corsair kind of gets around that by giving you the CPU cooler already. One of the biggest complaints is like, I need to find this low-profile CPU cooler, and am I sure it's going to offer enough cooling for the performance that I want to integrate? You don't have any of those concerns with the H6F that they included in this. Mounting the GPU is a little bit of a problem, as you can see in the video here, because it uses a ribbon cable extension for it, so it kind of mounts parallel with the motherboard as opposed to perpendicular like in every other case, again because of the size restrictions of the HTPC style design. But everything goes in. Like most home theater PC cases, you have to worry about cable routing a little bit more than you would normally, and making sure things are kind of installed in the right order so you don't, let's say, for example, you installed the graphics card before you actually attach the power cable to the graphics card. Now, routing that power cable is extremely difficult. So it's actually a little bit better to take the video card back out, attach the power cable, and then put the video card back in. So there's, a little bit of eccentricity in the design for that. But Corsair's pretty upfront about it in their instruction manuals about how you do it. And when you put it all together, I didn't do a whole bunch of benchmarking on it because, these are all components that we're pretty familiar with, and they're not going to perform differently just because of the system we're in as long as the cooling is effective. But I did use this opportunity to hook this up to the 4K OLED LG B6 TV that I had purchased and played some Resident Evil in HDR. And that's really good. It's really good looking. This is not a review of Resident Evil 7 in any degree or that TV, but I will say that it was awesome looking, and the Corsair system powered it. You know, and at any system, any PC with a 1080 in it is going to be able to do that. But we got this in a home theater design, and it was interesting to see, right? You know, it was louder while it was gaming than when you were watching video. But again, that's kind of par for the course when it comes to these types of things. So, and for $399, it's not a bad deal for the case, the motherboard, the power supply, and the CPU cooler. And you have all the functionality you need to build a pretty killer 4K gaming rig or whatever you need to do for something in that form factor.
You know, I think the best part is that unlike so many home theater PCs in the past, it is not covered with giant bright blue LEDs on the front.
Yeah, I can support that completely. For sure.
I can't look at my screen because of the giant blue display. AMD Ryzen 7 1800X review now and Zen.
You like that?
The build up, it's beautiful.
Thank you.
The build up for this has been going on forever. You probably already know that the 1800X, 1700X, and 1700. We talked about it last week. They're all offering 20 megabytes of cache. They're all running 8 cores, 16 threads. Overclocking is based on the chipset, not on the part itself. So they are very enthusiast. They're supportive of the enthusiast. I don't know how else to explain it. They are power sipping compared to the Intel parts, 14 nanometer FinFET process. The power consumption is looking fantastic. We'll talk about the architecture a little bit more in a minute, but you know, you're looking at 65 watts for a $329 Ryzen 7 1700. That's pretty equivalent or targeted at price-wise, street price at the Core i7 6900K or the Core i7 7700K. It lags significantly behind the Core i7 7700K, which is running at 4.2 gigahertz. The Ryzen 7 1700 is running at 3 gigahertz, which is problematic when you get to the fact that in single core performance, the AMD parts are lagging the Intel parts by a huge amount. Not nearly as much as we would have expected a couple years ago.
Yeah, I mean the performance profile. So like the only one that was benchmarked in my review was the 1800X. We have the 1700X and the 1700 that are being tested today for an updated story. Your summation at the beginning was pretty much spot on, right? Where the single-threaded performance was lower, and we expected it to be the case, and AMD was kind of putting that forward, and the multi-threaded performance was better, right? So if you're comparing it against the top-end Kaby Lake, you're going to win on multi-threaded apps, hands down. When you compare it to Broadwell E multi-threaded, it's going to be a mixed bag, ahead by a few points, behind by a few points, but very competitive at half the price. The biggest concern was on the gaming results, and they're the ones that were surprising. They're the ones that are, we differ in opinion on things with AMD on this, right? AMD was very much presenting benchmarks and a 4K to 2560 by 1400 resolution and quality settings, and they never really showed off 1080p results. It's kind of clear at this point why they didn't do it. The 1080p results, even though, I had a discussion with somebody this morning about like why test 1080p on a high-end processor like this, and the truth is that 1080p is still far and away the biggest, the most popular resolution for gamers, and that includes people who are running at 1080p 60, but also keep in mind 1080p 120, 1080p 144, 1080p 200 hertz, all these monitors that have higher refresh rates. Those are the types of enthusiasts and power users that are going for the higher end processors as well. So we tested at 1080p, kind of ultra, very high to ultra presets, depending on what they're doing. And it was surprisingly wide gap in a couple of instances. To be fair, we only tested a handful of games, and if you go to different reviews, they're going to use different software, and that's good, right? We want to see a wider coverage sample of this type of stuff. One of the things I want to do is actually get the 1800X back in the test bed and test maybe like a dozen games and see what we get from this. But it seems clear that in some cases, the 1800X and the Ryzen processors are significantly slower than the Sandy Bridge or Broadwell E, Ivy Bridge equivalents. So
it defines significantly slower.
Well, like this graph here is showing you 103 frames per second versus 135 frames per second. That's 30%. That's pretty dramatic. Much more than the 6 to 10% single-threaded performance delta that we would see otherwise, right? And so it's concerning for that. AMD's statement that they came out with today regarding gaming performance specifically was that they kind of recognized the 1080p results, said if you're gaming at higher resolutions than that, you don't have to worry about it because the processor becomes not one of the fundamental bottlenecks for the system. And as game developers become more familiar with the architecture, they'll be able to time it, or they'll be able to work on it and kind of improve things. And there's validity to that comment, even though it may seem like a cop-out in a lot of ways, is that just by default, all developers have been running on Intel processors. When you do your performance profiling in a game engine, you're just using an Intel system. You never really cared what the AMD performance was. Now I think that needs to be.
AMD walked away from the high-end market, in terms of desktop processors. So this is kind of a trap of AMD's own making. I mean, is this something that we might see game developers? It would seem to me that it would require a fairly intense amount of optimization and updating to improve performance. Has anybody, as a developer, commented on what it will take to improve performance for the AMD processors on their games?
Not to me specifically. The only comments I've gotten have come through AMD, so you got to take that for a grain of salt, if you will. But the developers of Total War series, the developers of Ashes of Singularity have talked about, we plan on optimizing the architecture. We plan on taking advantage of additional threads. But I think it's too early for anybody to say, we think we can get 10% out of this, or we think we can get 20% out of this if we optimize it, or there's a compiler addition or something like that. And to be fair to the critics of this stance, Ryzen is launching today, but it's not a new architecture. It's not a new processor to AMD. They could have and probably should have been banging this drum with developers for a while to avoid this issue. Because what we saw is, I would say in the last 2 months, we saw the Ryzen marketing and messaging being very gaming centric, to it has now shifted up until this week being much more productivity and creation centric, right? Because as they started to realize these are the results people were giving them, and this was going to be the landscape of messaging from that point forward, that they needed to make sure they positioned it in an appropriate way. And I don't want to discount the processor. I still don't think it's a bad part. I still think it's a really good part. For everything except 1080p gaming. If you're gaming at 25x14 or 4K, or those are your goals, or if you have a significantly lower power GPU that you plan on using for a while, then the performance is going to be fantastic. And if you do anything in the multi-threaded landscape, you were talking about your video production timelines and stuff. If you do anything in that regard, you're going to see a humongous perf increase against the 7700K and a huge perf per dollar increase over the 6900K. So AMD has an angle on both of those. It's just really unfortunate that the gaming tests that all the CPU reviews run, they've always been almost all 1080p, because that's where you want to try. Here's the thing: before, we were actively trying to find ways to differentiate CPU performance. So you would run it at 1080p or lower at low quality presets, and even then you would see very little differentiation between all of the Intel parts. Unfortunately, that mindset is what got us to the point where a lot of people were doing that. I think I saw somebody today ran a test at 800 by 600 at low quality settings, just so they could get the highest possible frequency of frame rate out of it, right? And I'm thinking, well, that's a little disingenuous. But 1080p Ultra is very realistic. It's very common, and I think it's a fair thing to think. And to AMD's credit, they didn't go on a rampage talking about nobody does that. The future is 4K, blah blah blah. They said, we're competitive in those areas. We wish you would look at those, but they didn't poo-poo the idea that 1080p was important at the very least. So
this is good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as people who deal a lot with video, as people who deal a lot, anybody out there who is desperate for multi-threaded application performance to improve vastly, you're looking at spending half as much for comparable Intel performance, and that's pretty exciting as far as I'm concerned.
Yep.
And with all due respect, I'll just get a bigger monitor.
That I'm sure they're totally fine with that. They have no problem with you adjusting for that.
But yeah, it's interesting, right? 1700 benchmarks, PC Pers are coming out. The PC Gamer and some other websites have found some early parts to review. It's been interesting to look at that because when you're looking at, again, it's the same story, but a little more dramatic, right? Because it's sitting at a $329 point. If you're a pure gamer and you're at 1080p, you're looking, you are behind an Intel part. If you are, a content creator or dealing with applications that can take advantage of 16 cores or 8 cores and 16 threads, then Ryzen starts really looking compelling for the money. Just keep an eye on the benchmarks, keep an eye on the games you play, and think about getting a bigger monitor to go along with your massive new system. 1080 Ti basically announced at Game Developers Conference. Ryan posted his review early this morning, and in fact, there's a GTX 1080 Ti live stream going on with NVIDIA's Tom Peterson right now, which will be available for streaming later on should you want to get in depth with Ryan and Mr. Peterson. And they're also going to be talking about the FCAT VR testing tool that Ryan introduced to you last week. Have you had a chance to remotely see the performance of the 1080 Ti? I know you're not in Kentucky at the PC Per headquarters.
Yeah, I looked at the benchmarks, and it's funny. What happens when you take a Titan X and you increase the base and boost clocks? This is the same GP 102 core.
Right.
But for some reason, I've been trying to wrap my mind around this. One of the memory controllers is disabled. So you have 11 gigabytes of memory. We heard that, and it's like, that's not right. Like these rumors, they come out weeks in advance, and like 11 gigabytes.
Sure.
But it is 11 gigabytes. They up the memory speed, though. Like they're clocking it at 11 gigahertz. So it's all about 11 with this card, and a very odd 352-bit memory interface. But plenty of bandwidth, the same number of CUDA cores as the Titan X, and as you might imagine, higher clocks equal higher performance. And it's less expensive.
That's what's kind of amazing to me, because you look at the specs for the $1,200 GTX, the NVIDIA Titan X versus the GTX 1080 Ti, and it's, the base clock on the 1080 Ti is higher, the boost clock is higher. It's got the same number of texture units, 8 fewer ROP units, 1 gigabyte less memory, a slightly faster memory clock, or 10% faster memory clock. That 352-bit memory interface, which saves them from not using G5X memory. A touch faster in memory bandwidth, same 250-watt TDP, peak computing at 10.6 teraflops to the Titan X's 10.1 teraflops, and it costs $700 to the Titan X's $1,200. That's impressive.
Yeah, so if you're looking for the absolute fastest single GPU card right now, and it's kind of crazy that they're only selling it for $699. I say only $699. Of course, it's still expensive, and you can do a lot with less money, but it's kind of their flagship right now, it would seem, and it's at least they've come down a little bit. It's more like a realistic number. We were thinking $800 probably. So it's a little surprising. Of course, you can't buy it anywhere, but I'll be surprised if you can get the Founders Edition day one for $699. We'll see.
Yeah, it's impressive, right? You're looking at a slight in a lot of the benchmarks, slightly beating the Titan X. You're looking at in some benchmarks, I'm looking at a 25 or 30% gain over the GTX 1088 gigabyte card. Probably 2/3 faster than a 980 Ti. The performance is pretty impressive. Whether or not you need it is an entirely different question. I think if you're running VR, if you're running 4K video, if you don't want to run SLI, this starts getting really compelling. But when you look at these benchmarks, like I'm looking at Tomb Raider DX12 and the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti and the Titan X Pascal are not quite mirror images of each other, but there's so many benchmarks where we look at them, and like the green line for the 1080 Ti and the black line for the Pascal are just kind of hovering over each other. It is pretty impressive what they're delivering for the money with this card, if you need a card at the very high end.
Yes.
And it's even quieter by a decibel, 2.2 decibels at load than the Titan X.
It doesn't sound like much, but as we both know, 2 decibels is actually, it's pretty noticeable. Like 3 is really noticeable.
Yeah, it's fast. Ryan notes that you're going to get like 0 to 8% in favor of the GTX 1080 Ti across 2560 by 1440 and 4K resolutions versus the Titan 10. That's pretty amazing. And again, versus the GTX 1080, 2560 by 1440. Quote, the GTX 1080 ranged from 2% faster in Grand Theft Auto 5 and Gears of War to 42% faster in Dirt Rally. The average improvement was 25%, including the 2% outliers. At 4K, that average difference jumps to 36%, with Dirt Rally showing the biggest gain at 50%. This is crazy. This is a card that cost $100 more than the GTX 1080 launched at, and $200 more than the reduced price on the 1080, which means the 1080 right now is a pretty fantastic deal if you're looking for a high-powered GPU. I tested this a Pascal Quadro round up to P2000, P3000, P5000 to scratch the itch of a lot of PC Per readers who have always kind of been curious about what's going on with the professional GPUs. And that would be the P2000, P4000, and P5000, which range from 1,024 CUDA cores up to 2,560 CUDA cores.
So the 2,000, 4,000, and 5,000 are basically like, think of them as just like roughly equivalent to 1060, a 1070, and 1080. Right. As far as, how everything works. Now, they did juggle slightly on like cores and, other specs, rearranged slightly. But for the most part, that's kind of what they're equivalent to. And then Ken also threw in the Radeon Pro Duo, which is I think the only equivalent card on the AMD side that we had in the office at the time. Results did some interesting things depending on which results you're looking at. So, there's obviously different kinds of workloads that people are going to buy these kinds of cards for, right? There was a bunch of spec view perf, different like types of models to process, and for the most part, you'd end up seeing the Radeon Pro Duo come pretty far behind the 3 NVIDIA parts, and the 3 NVIDIA parts scaled pretty linearly. If you look at like most of those charts, you see the three green bars there, basically just, stair steps. And then you have the Radeon Pro Duo, which is, kind of running pretty low there. But you have to realize there's 2 GPUs on that card, and these tests are only using a single GPU. Right? So when you consider all of that, now you have a little more of the story, right? But then once you get down to Showcase 1, which I think is like another, I'm not sure how far you went, or if you went past where I was at. There were a few examples where the Radeon Pro Duo was, more in line with where you would expect it to be based on its price compared to the price of the other parts. But if you go to the next page there, where you get into OpenCL and CUDA, OpenCL is the thing that AMD Radeon stuff is more known for supporting very well. So if you look at that first chart result there, scroll down just a tiny bit more, you'll end up seeing the single GPU Radeon Pro Duo performing as well as the Quadro P5000, like the highest end one.
Whoa.
And then if you throw in the second GPU, because you can tell Luxmark to use multiple GPUs there, you get an even better score. It even scales better than 100%, presumably because that single GPU is also trying to do desktop, rendering. It's trying to do the things you're in Windows, right? So the GPU is busy doing some other stuff at the same time as doing that rendering in the background. Whereas if you put it in dual mode, that second GPU is, otherwise just sitting there idle. So you have, one more full idle GPU to throw at that workload there. Similar kind of results in Blender. Basically we just wanted to be able to sit down and go through, these different tools and give people an idea of what kind of performance you would see if you wanted to drop enough coin to, to go to a real high end, rendering GPU like that.
And it's a considerable expense to go to a professional grade GPU.
It is. Some other things to note, just generally speaking, is they managed to get the P4000, which was the 1070 equivalent part, down to a single slot. So it's a blower style cooler, but it's a single slot cooler.
Nice.
Meaning you can have more of those in a system if you were gonna, go for throwing a whole bunch of GPUs in the system, right? So that may come into play on, how you're basing your purchasing decisions as well. Might also be, if you wanted to go the Quadro side, it might also be a little bit better to go with the P4000 versus the P5000, because in some of the tests we saw diminishing returns as you'd see 2000 to 4000 would scale pretty linearly, and then it would start to fall off as it got to the P5000 as far as your rendering performance went. So, just different things to weigh in your decision. Obviously, if you're going to put this much money down, you're probably going to look at the one specific kind of tool that you're going to be using, before you go spending thousands of dollars on a machine that can process information with that one tool as fast as possible. That's what my guess would be, but who's to say? Really depends on what your situation is. Yeah, cool stuff there. Maybe in the future we'll look at this more once we can get some more hardware in. Kind of the holdup on a test like this, since the GPUs are so expensive and people might be apprehensive on sampling them.
Yeah, and the market for them is relatively small compared to consumer.
It is a very niche kind of even the article is, a very, very small subset of your folks out there are going to benefit from it.
But if you're curious, the information is there. This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by GoToWebinar, the webinar platform that's hosted 2.7 million interactive web events with over 60 million views per year. GoToWebinar believes webinars are one of the best ways to interact with your prospects and customers instead of business presentations or company websites. With GoToWebinar, you can create custom email invitations, confirmations, and reminders, or let GoToWebinar handle it with automated email templates. Display your company logo and custom image on all webinar materials. Create and schedule pre-recorded webinars that are as interactive as live events. Mobile friendly, schedule a webinar, edit a session, or track performance from your iOS or Android device. Create up to 20 polls before the session or on the fly for audience interaction. You can add up to 20 questions to a survey and engage participants with Q&A. Engage your audience with more than one presenter and panelist. Up to 6 presenters can share their webcams and participate face-to-face. You can broadcast a view of your desktop or a specific application. And with GoToWebinar's reporting and analytics, you're just a click away from qualified leads, metrics, and data to improve webinars. You have end-to-end 120-bit AES encryption. It's rated #1 in customer satisfaction. Turn your next presentation into a conversation with GoToWebinar. For more information, visit gotowebinar.com/podcast. That's gotowebinar.com/podcast. And we want to thank GoToWebinar for their support of This Week in Computer Hardware.
Ryan went unhinged on an RX 580 8GB card. This is not, as we love to say, the fastest GPU ever. And AMD made that really clear.
Yeah,
and that's not a bad thing. Go ahead.
I mean, no, it's not a bad thing. As long as you're setting your expectations at the proper level, everything should be fine. I think it's fair to say that the RX 500 series, 580, 570, 560
is pretty close to a rebrand of the 480, 470, 460. There's a little bit more. It's not a simple rebadge, but there is a little bit more involved in it. But what it is not Vega. It is not a new GPU. It is not fundamentally technologically different from what existed with Polaris in the first iteration, right? So you still have the same core counts. You still have the same memory bus width. You still have the same, it's still 2304 stream processors, 144 texture units, 32 ROPs, 4 gig and 8 gig capacities available, 8 gigahertz memory, 256-bit interface, 256 gigabytes per second of RAM. Like all those specs remain the same. The only thing that changes spec-wise is the rated clock speeds go up on the 580 versus the 480.
So you get a magnificent, huge boost in performance over the 480
of 80 megahertz, which is not what I would consider to be a magnificent boost. It is 5.8% as I bring up the calculator on my laptop. So you're getting out of the box a 5% increase in clock speed. And in theory, you should be able to run at the higher boost rates a little bit longer than and more consistently than in the previous generation. Also because the only other thing that has changed is kind of the TDP and the power structure on these cards. If you remember back to the RX 480, there was a bunch of stuff about it being 150 watt TDP card, but it never actually really ran as low as 150. It was always running a little bit more than that, and it had issues with power draw from the motherboard or the 6-pin power connector.
As somebody who was circling that car for a micro ITX build, a super tiny build with a 250 watt power supply, I was painfully aware that it was 150 watts until the parts shipped, and then it was way beyond what had been expected. But the 580, for the overclocked 580s, they are actually, is it 225 watts, 250 watts maximum?
So the reference performance is 185. Reference setting is 185 watts. But they put an 8-pin power connector on the card. So in theory, you have up to 225 watts for the add-in card vendor to kind of make changes and be a little bit more creative with their designs, if you want to call it that. For example, the MSI card that we got in for our testing is a little bit on the higher side, $250 price point. It used anywhere from 200 to 210 watts of power playing games at 2560 by 1440. So, definitely if you just look at it in that respect, you're jumping from a card that was supposed to be 150 watts but never actually was, and is now a 200 plus watt video card. So, it's not the end of the world. It's not like, we're not going to recommend this card because it uses more power than previous card or NVIDIA's options. But it's worth noting just the difference, right? It's clear that AMD's mindset has shifted a little bit from we need to compete and make sure that we can prove we're a very power efficient architecture to, screw it. Let's just get as much performance as we can and compete at the performance per dollar metric instead. And, they help themselves out a little bit in that way. But keeping in mind that like the GTX 1060 6 gigabyte card that we tested it against is using like 70 to 80 watts less power while gaming. That's a significant amount if you are building a small form factor system, as you were talking about.
Well, okay, so we've got a whole slate of new cards. The RX 550, which is like an $80. I'm replacing the onboard graphics in my machine. I need a simple dedicated GPU, for a 4K home theater build. The RX 560, the RX 570, which may be kind of like the sweet spot for this series. Then the RX 580. Should be street price around $230 for the base stock version of the RX 580. How's the performance comparing with the 1060?
So in my testing, the 1060 was still faster. Not by a huge amount. I would say on average 5 to 7%. There was one instance where it was significantly faster, 18 to 20%. And then there were a couple of instances where, the AMD card was either tying or a couple of percent ahead. So it's closer than it was. The 580 makes up some of the difference between the 480 and the 1060, but not all of it. Mm-hmm. I would still give NVIDIA the advantage in terms of performance in that segment. And considering that, the pricing is pretty much identical between the 580 and the 1060. Obviously, it's going to vary depending on the partner card and the overclock settings and the day of the week that you're purchasing and all that type of stuff. It's close enough that I would still give the edge of the 1060, but AMD has closed the gap, and that's all they really wanted to do. They're not trying to make the claim that the 580 is an upgrade for 480. They're not trying to make the claim that if you know, this is more for if you are still on a 2-year-old video card, the 580 is now a better option than the 480. And it's true. They absolutely were able to achieve that by improving clock speeds, increasing clock speeds at the expense of power draw to make themselves slightly more competitive against the GeForce line.
And one of the things they point out in the press materials is that if you look at Steam analytics, you're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 million gamers, 500 million gamers that have cards that are more than 2 years old. People are barely, the vast majority of gamers on Steam are barely using 1080p. They're not using 4K. They're not using 2560 by 1440, but they're 1080 and well below that in terms of the resolution they're playing at. So this is really sitting in the sweet spot of the GPU market, unlike the 480, you've got HEVC, H.265 4K decoding. Well, let's talk about Radeon Chill at this point. Are you seeing any major gains in terms of, reducing? I mean, we should probably just talk about what Radeon Chill is actually designed to do, which is lower the temperatures or the power consumption of the processor, right?
Yeah, so I'll be very upfront here. I have been told and kind of lectured on it several times. I have not spent very much time with it. Maybe 10, 20, 30 minutes with it. The idea of it is really interesting. It's supposed to reduce the use on the GPU depending on the activity going on in the game, right? But it is a whitelist feature, meaning it has to be enabled on a per game basis. It's not kind of enabled globally. And it works in a way that, like, if the game detects that you're not hitting the keys or moving the mouse or firing a gun or whatever it happens to be in the game, it will lower the rendered frame rate because nothing is changing on the screen, or things aren't changing on the screen in any kind of pace that it should impact your experience, right? And then the idea is, as soon as you hit W to walk forward, it ramps the GPU back up to its maximum clock speed. You're rendering at full frames, and the idea is that you can lower your average power consumption and GPU temperature while not adversely affecting the gaming experience, right? So the problems I have with it are that it's a whitelist feature, it's not global, and it's in the time I tested it with it, which was like the flagship game they were showing at the time, it worked fine. It worked perfectly well, and it lowers your average GPU clock, thus lowering your GPU temperature and increasing your power efficiency. But it's a fairly small subset of games, and if you're always moving, always doing something, it's never going to come into play, right? So it really comes down to your play style, the game itself, and what kind of things you're happy with in terms of the experience. Fundamentally, I have a difficult time believing that it can have zero effect on, frame variance and frame time and stutter and that type of stuff, because you are changing the clock speed of the GPU pretty quickly, pretty often. And even when the 480 initially launched, we saw, or no, it was the 480. It was like the 290X. When the 290X initially launched, we saw huge clock speed variations in it because of thermal constraints, and we saw increased variance in the frame times and a little bit less smooth gameplay because of it. So I need to spend more time with it. I do not think it's the magic bullet that suddenly makes the RX 580 as power efficient or more power efficient enough to somehow compete with the GTX 1060. I don't think they're going to make up 50% of their power consumption, or whatever it is, across a wide range of games with that feature. It's neat. And if they can figure out a way to implement it in more games more of the time, that could be one of the things that helps address power consumption issues that they currently have.
PS4 Pro SSD upgrade to SATA 3 make a difference. Jim Tanis wrote that up. It's kind of impressive. At the very least, the SATA 3 interface on the PlayStation 4 Pro does make a difference if your games are bottlenecked by storage performance. The non-Pro PS4 going to a Samsung 850 resulted in a 9.8% improvement in loading times over the stock hard disk drive, anywhere from 0% to as much as 22% faster. The PS4 Pro, which can do full SATA 3 speeds, saw an overall average improvement of 27.5%, ranging from 7% to a whopping 66%. That's huge. Now you're also talking about they used a 1 terabyte, or they used a 1 terabyte Samsung 850 EVO, which is a $350 SSD, which is a significant percentage of the cost of the console. Literally, like basically the same amount as you would spend on the console. If you have 3 games, you don't need to buy a 1 terabyte drive. If you have a ton of games, you might want to go whole hog on the 350 just to spend less time loading stuff. The other thing to think about is this is also before 4K really gets serious on the PS4 Pro, because there just really aren't much in the way of high-resolution 4K games on the PlayStation 4. But 4K games, are going to be using larger textures, bigger assets, which is going to make the bottlenecking on the original hard drive more noticeable. So something to think about, and an interesting read if you want to kind of get into the nitty-gritty on upgrading your PlayStation 4 Pro or your PlayStation. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Like the standard hard disk drive versus an SSD on a PlayStation versus an SSD in a PlayStation Pro 4, taking load times from nearly 50 seconds down to 26 seconds. A 50% improvement in load times, to me, is nothing to sneeze about. But then if you look at some of the other games, it might be 2 seconds on a 14-second load time. So
I will say one of the interesting topics that came up in our discussion of this story yesterday was that in some of the games, the developers had hidden load times behind specific sequences, right? Longer form animations, like in Grand Theft Auto 5, when you do character switches, there's a zoom out from that character, a pan across the map, and then it zooms into a character, and it's like a 15-second process. And if you look at the testing that Jim did in that particular instance, like it shows no advantage from the hard drive to the SSD, which is unlikely to be true, right? But instead, what our working theory is that in that particular instance, that the developer realized that there was a load time, and they just built this animation around it, and it's not a variable speed animation. So they just kind of, it's 14 seconds or 13 seconds, kind of no matter what. Again, we don't know this for sure. This is just kind of what we're guessing, but it makes sense. And if you look at some of the other games, you'll see the same type of stuff where, transitioning between maps and stuff, like they go, well, okay, in general, console hardware is static, so you know how long it would take to load between these two sections. So, okay, how do we make this less painful, or the appearance or effectiveness of being less painful to the consumer? We just make something pretty happen on the screen. And in those instances, it's possible that like upgrading to an SSD won't matter. But if you look at the other part of GTA where you're just loading up the map, when you see that huge drop in performance, yeah, you go from 73 seconds to 25 seconds to load up the single player save game, right? Going from a hard drive to an SSD on the same PS4 Pro hardware. That's a dramatic jump. So
yeah.
My kind of takeaway from this was the sooner we can get SSDs to the point where they're cheap enough to be included in game consoles, that developers will be able to better take advantage of the total system performance, because they won't have to worry about some of those types of things. It's one of those like chicken egg debates about, does the software developer write in preparation for newer hardware, or does the newer hardware have to exist before the game developers are willing to spend the time to write to it and address it? And this seems to be one of those instances where maybe we're seeing both.
Did you just ask which came first, the chicken or the egg?
I usually on a regular cadence I do that, actually. Yeah. I don't have the necessary verbal vocabulary to extend much beyond that.
No, but it's pretty accurate either way. It is all about Ryan Shrout getting pause on the Intel Core i9-7900X 10-core Skylake X processor review, which technically is faster than my Ryzen CPU, but cost how much more, sir? How much more did it cost?
Some dollars.
Some dollars.
Some dollars more. I don't know which Verizon CPU you have, actually, so I guess it's impossible for me to answer that question immediately.
I have an 1800X.
Okay, so it's double the price. Yours was MSRP $499. You probably paid a little bit less than that. This one launches at $999.
Huh.
So, we've talked a lot about Skylake X and these processor launches. This is kind of like the first wave of them. They're going to come in multiple waves. This is the 10-core and below launch. So your 10, 8, 6, and 4-core parts that fit on this platform. The 4 cores that are Skylake X parts. The 10, 8, and 6 are your Skylake X parts. Intel only sent us over the 10-core processor for this review. We have the 4-core Skylake X we're doing stuff on as well. So we talked a lot about the specifications, right? The 7900X is the 10-core, 20-thread replacement. It is. How do I say this? Last year's flagship was the 6950X. It was a 10-core processor from Intel. This is the replacement in that segment at 10 cores. And if you go down to the second table, actually, that compares the 7900X to just the 6950X and the 7700K, you see a couple of interesting things that give you a clue as to what the performance is actually going to be like. One is you get 10 cores on the new part, 10 cores on the old part, and 4 cores on the Skylake 7700K. So I picked these two comparisons because the Core i7 6950X was generally considered the top performer multi-threaded processor for a consumer. And the Core i7 7700K was generally considered the best single-threaded or lightly threaded processor that a consumer could buy. So if you look at these specs, you kind of see there's like a merging of them on the Core i9-7900X. So you get 10 cores still, but the base clock is a little bit higher than the last year's Enthusiast part. But if you look at the Turbo Boost 2, which is the clock speed of a maximum clock speed for all of the cores in single-threaded or lightly threaded applications, you see it's 4.3 gigahertz, which is within spitting distance, if you will, of the 7700K's speed. And if you look at what the X29 platform / Core i9-7900X has, something called Turbo Boost Max 3.0, which is the ability for it to pick specific cores on the die that can perform better and clock those a little bit higher, you get up to 4.5. So what you see is, if you look over at the 7700K and the 7900X clock speeds, they're within range of each other now, right? The base clocks are definitely significantly different, but I never really saw it go down to 3.3, even fully loaded for running like Blender rendering over the course of, literally 10 to 12 minutes of full load. We saw those clock speeds hitting about 4 gigahertz on all 10 cores. It's quad channel DDR4 up to 2666 supported. Obviously, you can clock it higher if you have higher speed memory. 140 watt TDP. And then that last line is what's really important as well. Last year's 6950X got demolished in the media and from consumers because it launched at $1,700. And it was a drastic jump over what we had seen previous, like Extreme Edition flagship parts from Intel in the past. So even though $999 is still very expensive for a consumer CPU, it is worth noting that it is $700 less than the 10-core processor last year, while offering better performance pretty much across the board.
Well, this is good, right? Because we've had these minimal performance increases from Intel for the last couple generations on the desktop. Power, sort of power efficiency in terms of mobile has been a fantastic story. Overall performance has not been a great story if you are at the far end of the bell curve and need all the power. But, obviously, Intel has shifted the price down because, B, they're also going to be going up to the Skylake X stuff with the 7980XE, which is going to be selling for $2,000. With, that's their Threadripper competitor with the 18 cores, 36 threads.
Yeah, so they're definitely going to have more expensive options, but the way I'm looking at this is the number of people that need more than 10 cores, honestly, the number of people that need 10 cores for stuff is fairly small. And as you go above that, it becomes even smaller. And what Intel has shown to do with this part is they're able to offer a CPU that has as good of single-threaded performance as the 7700K, while improving on the multi-threaded performance of the 6950X. So, last year they said that was the goal last year when they started introducing this idea of Turbo Boost Max technology, was to be able to like make sure you had the option to have superior single-threaded performance without sacrificing, but you still had all of the cores and all of the threads necessary for the best multi-threading performance when those workloads were more necessary. And this is much closer to that capability than they were at last year, right? The single-threaded performance of the 6950X was its detriment last year. This year, the 7900X doesn't really have that. If you look at some of the performance results, like if you go to the page titled Media Encoding and Rendering, and you go down and just kind of look at Cinebench, for example, Cinebench R15 single-threaded, you'll see the single-threaded performance of the 7900X is, essentially identical to that of the 7700K, which was the highest processor in our testing up until this. And then if you look down at the multi-threaded performance result, it's got a solid 25% improvement. 15% improvement over the 6950X, right? So it is the new best multi-threaded processor. Now, a lot of questions about what AMD is going to do with Threadripper, and then if you want just massive amounts more, you could wait for up to Intel's 18-core part. Which is like, as you look at the market today, they've done a very good job of creating an incredibly high-performance part for people that want to do that. There is one performance oddity that is worth discussing quickly, and that is on the 1080p gaming performance. You remember, probably not that long ago, we were talking a lot about the Ryzen processor and its 1080p gaming situation, if you want to call it that. As it turns out, there were some architectural changes in Skylake X that bring about a similar oddity. The architectural changes being they moved from a ring bus, which in a simple format is a bidirectional but linear communication method between all the cores, the caches, the memory controllers, PCI Express, whatever. They've moved over to a mesh interface, which lowers the average latency of memory, but it increases the maximum latency of memory, right? And for a very similar reason to what we saw with Ryzen, the L3 cache is slower on Skylake X than Broadwell E, which exhibits the behavior in 1080p gaming as slightly slower scores. Now, if you look at like Civ 6 and Far Cry Primal, the differences are actually pretty big. But in general, it's just a couple of percent slower than the 6950X, which is not that big of a deal, but it's worth noting. And also worth noting because the clock speed of the 7900X is significantly higher. So if we were to match the clock rates of these two processors, we would actually see that detriment extend down some for the 7900X, kind of as if we wanted to just prove out that, okay, this architecture is less efficient at this workload. You would do that. So, all of the talk we had about the Ryzen stuff, and that, why was the 1080p gaming performance slow? And then we eventually figured it out, and it was like, okay, what's AMD going to do about this? And they working with game developers on engine optimization. Intel's now kind of in the same boat.
Everything
because
old
of
is
this
new again.
re-architecture. Yeah. Now the delta is less, right? And I think in all, we tested 8 different games, and I think in all but one of them, and it was a very small difference, 126 versus 124 frames per second. In all but one of them, the Ryzen 7 1800X was slower or even with the 7900X. So the 7900X is a small step back from the 6950 for 1080p gaming, not higher res gaming, but 1080p gaming. But it's still able to kind of maintain its advantage over Ryzen in those instances, right? So take that for what you will.
I'm also
so that's like the performance oddity.
I'm just going to be obnoxious here and say, if you're spending $400, $600, $1,000 or more on a CPU, you really need to upgrade beyond the 1080p monitor. Just do yourself that favor.
100% with you. 100% with you. Yeah. I put that comment on the last page. It's like if there was a lot of discussion about people who buy $500 processors aren't doing 1080p gaming, and if you subscribe to that, then you definitely believe that people who are buying $1,000 processor aren't doing 1080p gaming. So,
although there are a lot of people out there doing 1080p gaming. I was going to say the other thing is and due fairness is as much as I want to be like $1,000 processor. One, just to emphasize, as Ryan said, if AMD Ryzen didn't exist, I think the Core i9-7900X, if it was even released at all, would probably be a $1,500 or $1,800 part. And number two, for a comparable number of cores and threads, the Core i7-7820X is $100 more. Now, you could say that's, you could say that that's 25% more than the AMD Ryzen, but it's
that to me is probably the most interesting. Like I wanted, if I wanted to get another part in immediately, it wouldn't be Skylake X. I kind of know what that's going to be performance wise.
Sure.
The 8-core versus 8-core battle is very interesting, right? So the $100 price delta is more manageable for people, and then you get into what can the Ryzen 7 1800X really do against the IPC improvements and that type of stuff. So this is actually a good reminder for me. I'm gonna bug Intel about getting in the 7820 and maybe just the 7800 as well, because that's $389, and that kind of goes up against the 1700X Ryzen part. So, but you're 100% right in that I think these parts were going to be released anyway. Like this was on their roadmap. They probably brought it in a little bit, maybe a month or two early, trying to make sure that they would beat Threadripper to the punch and kind of get some extra momentum that way, even though their high core count parts aren't going to be till after. But the pricing definitely was adjusted, and Intel will tell you as much, right? If you talk to their marketing and their product managers and stuff behind closed doors, they don't want to go out and like talk about it on their earnings call, but they'll say, yes, of course, this was a reaction to the reemergence of competition in this market. And I saw a lot of reviewers and a lot of commenters talking about this part, like talking about that process as a negative, right? Like, the only reason these priced to this much is because they're reacting to AMD. And I was like, maybe it's been so long that you don't remember, but that's expected. That's what you want to happen. You would have
that's the whole
Intel
point of having competition.
Exactly. The Intel reacts, makes a part that's slightly better and slightly lower price, and then AMD does the same thing back again. And that's what we want. And you want to see that in the CPUs, you want to see that in the GPUs, right? That's why we want Vega to be successful and come out at the right price point with the right performance to really kind of move and cycle things forward. So I don't see this as a negative. I would caution people into buying these parts until we see Threadripper, right? Threadripper's not that far away, but it's like, a month plus, right? So if you can wait that long, then it might be worth seeing, because chances are there will be a Threadripper processor at $1,000 or less that has more cores. And how that performs, I don't know. We'll have to see what the clock speeds turn out to be. But it will be more interesting than just where it is now.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see that, because you look at like the Ryzen 7 1700X, the Ryzen 7 1800X, like on a handbrake test. They're within 10 seconds of each other. The Core i9-7900X significantly faster than a Ryzen 7 1800X, in part because it has 2 more cores, 4 more threads. I would think. I don't know the maximum number of threads that Handbrake will handle, but also because on a per core basis, I think the Core i9-7900X is definitely faster. So is it worth paying twice as much to be just under 30% faster on rendering? Not quite for me this week, but I'm with you. I think that sort of 8-core, 10-core battle later this summer is going to be, it's going to be awesome for consumers and content creators that are looking to buy a new machine. This is exciting stuff.
I agree.
Exciting stuff.
I think a lot of people had negative feelings about this launch, regardless of what it was going to be, because you saw the flagship part was $2,000. We found out that those parts weren't going to be released until later. Kind of adding into the story that Intel was just scrambling to come up with some kind of thing. And $1,000 is still a lot of money, but I'm impressed that the single-threaded performance compared to the previous 10-core part went up as much as it did. Like, we're talking 25 to 35% in our testing, and then multi-threaded still gets a sizable boost. It does draw a lot of power. There's the 1080p gaming concern in there, so check out the full review that I wrote if you want to see all those details. But a better part launch than I had originally thought. So.
Ace Predator Z271T with Tobii Eye Tracking, the monitor that watches you back. And my first thought on that was, OMG, there's finally a product with Tobii in it. Because I first had a hands-on demo with Tobii several years ago at CES. And what it does is it tracks where your pupils are looking on the screen. So you can kind of like, look at something on the screen and blink, as sort of a right click, left click. Jim Tanaus did the review up on PC Per. What were you using to control with the Tobii Eye Tracking, and was he successful?
So it was games, right? Like, I mean, this is it's a G-Sync monitor, so it's meant for gamers. The Tobii accessory is added onto games. There's a subset of games, obviously, that are going to support something like this. They actually have, a pretty good software collection that allows you to know what games you have installed that have support for it, and it very clearly walks you through like what settings you should run it at to create the best experience for you with the Tobii Eye Tracking stuff. It's a pretty good overall monitor, right? It's a curved, kind of a steep curve, if you will, a heavy curve. For a 27-inch, 16:9 monitor.
Sure.
But it's got G-Sync support, so you get all the other kind of high-end gaming features you're looking for. Games like, let's see, what did he have in here? Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Arma 2 and 3. I can't read anymore. Blind Love, DCS World, Deus Ex, Mankind Divided. Like there's a pretty good list of games, and then there's different experiences that you go with. He tested Elite Dangerous, Euro Truck Simulator 2, Ghost Recon Wildlands, and Dying Light. The ideas are pretty cool, like the clean UI, where it dims or minimizes the UI elements when you're not looking at them, but then when you do look at them, it brightens them up or it pops them up from the bottom of the screen, something like that. The aim at gaze, bring up a weapon, and you can kind of more accurately or detail the cursor accuracy, the cursor where it's pointing for the weapon. Dynamic HDR is the ability to, wherever you're looking, if the screen is darker, it will brighten the darker space up, but overexpose the lighter space, as if you're kind of emulating what your human eye does when you're looking in a darker area, and everything else around it kind of blows up a little bit, and vice versa. And then auto pause, which is if you look away from the screen or you get up and walk away, it kind of automatically hits escape or pauses the game or does something to that effect. So there's some interesting ideas there. We did have a technical problem with the display where towards the end of our loaner time period, it just stopped working. Like the USB device from the monitor to the PC kind of never showed up again.
Ouch.
But we had a pretty good amount of time with it, and kind of him going through experiences and whatnot that is expressed in the review, I think, fairly well. So other than that, I don't think that's indicative of any wider scale reliability issue, but I haven't heard for sure one way or the other. So it's a little bit on the expensive side as well, and because there's no directly comparable 1080p G-Sync 144 hertz curved monitor like this, we don't know how much of an add-on price or add-on to the price that the Tobii technology provides. But I think it's really cool. I just don't know if it's mature enough yet that I'd recommend people go out and spend extra money for it yet. I know they did. I assume they still do sell external cameras that will sit on like webcams that sit on top of your monitor to use Tobii technology, and that might be something worth looking into if you want to try it out. That's a little bit less of an investment. You can keep the monitor you already have, so that might be worth checking out. Yeah, so it's like the Tobii Eye Tracker 4C and the Tobii Eye X, I guess. So we're at 159 pounds. It's still pretty pricey.
Seasonic Focus Plus Platinum 550 watt power supply units. Is it awesome?
Well, I mean, the key here is just they're getting a platinum rating in a relatively low wattage power supply, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
which is good.
Also relatively compact, right? But so, yeah, some people that want to run a lower power system, like a lower wattage requirement system, would also still want to be really efficient. Usually, those are kind of contradictory, right? Usually, you get more efficient at the, generally speaking, and like it's easier to do with like putting some. Like some of the higher power output units tend to go into the platinum range because that's where you'd really care more about being more efficient because you're putting less heat out from the power supply. But now they're kind of, the platinum rating is kind of moving down into the lower end of the spectrum there as far as your power output. So $100 for a 550 watt platinum rated power supply. And of course, Lee did all of his, detailed tests that he does on a power supply. So the rating, what was the max rating he got? So at 275 watt draw, which is actually a pretty, reasonable spot for a typical system that's not kind of like a power user system. 92.5% efficiency. That's pretty good. And that's on 120 volt source. So if you're overseas and you get one of these and you use it on a 240 volt supply, the efficiency actually goes even higher, I think.
Nothing wrong with that. It's some people might say it's a little expensive, but again, it's 80 plus platinum. Build quality should be outstanding. 80 plus platinum rated, and then 550 watts continuous DC output at up to 50 degrees Celsius, which is 122-ish degrees, should you be thinking in Fahrenheit instead of Celsius. 10-year warranty. Again, we are seeing a bunch of power supplies that are being over-engineered and given particularly amazing warranties. So I am all with having a power supply that creates no issues for me. So if you're looking for something, and it's funny, like I was going to say like 550 watts for $99.99 or $99.90 USD on Newegg, topping out at 850 watts for $140. So
yeah.
Lots
I mean, don't get me wrong.
options.
You can find cheaper 550 watt power supplies out there, but not as well efficiency rated and with not as long of a warranty. So
10 years.
So, you get what you pay for.
Oh my goodness.
I'm doing good.
There's small creatures sneaking in over my shoulder right now.
I see your spawn over there.
There was a Netflix fail. Hard to tell if this was a user or an interface issue, but I'm putting my money on the user in this case. The last time I had this particular moment, it was much more intense. And I was sitting in one of the last Apple events I was invited to attend before I was forgotten or blacklisted. I can't remember which. I think I was blacklisted and then forgotten. But it was when Steve Jobs reversed all of the bull honky he'd been slinging about Intel processor performance because they moved the entire line of Apple PCs, desktops, and MacBooks over to Intel processors. And this is so bizarre to me. Intel has announced new CPUs integrating AMD Radeon graphics. Just let that sink in for a second.
Yeah. You heard that, folks. You heard what he just said.
And when we're going to say two other things in just a second that are even crazier. But what's going on? I mean, this looks like what I will affectionately call a frickin' massive processor.
Well, I mean, it's not just a processor, right? I mean, there's an extra what is it called? A multi-die interconnect bridge, I believe, is the new term that Intel's using there. But it's kind of like the thing that we saw like with the Vega GPUs, where they had the memory integrated right next to the GPU, all within the same substrate, just all mounted to the same little kind of like an interim PCB or whatever you want to call it. Just some method of grouping the things before you put them onto the motherboard. And that's what's going on here. So Intel had this, they already had this technology, this way of linking, their CPU with something off to the side in a relatively fast communicating manner and whatnot. but they just wanted to have, the ability to put a faster GPU on there, faster than what they can do themselves. Now, these parts are supposed to still have the Intel integrated GPU as well. It's just that the end result, when you put it into a system, a laptop, low power kind of desktop system, maybe, when you put this combined part in there, it will act just as if you had a discrete GPU along with a CPU, like where you had those laptops that can use the integrated graphics and then they can switch over on the fly to, a GeForce something or an AMD something, right?
Right.
Same deal here, except the packaging is way smaller, right? The footprint way smaller, and you're still getting decent performance. We had some leaked performance numbers, I believe, that are in that article. If you scroll a little further down, and the figures that we saw come out in the leak ran somewhere between a mobile 1050 Ti and a mobile GTX 1060. So in something that's in a very compact form factor, that's taking something, somewhere around half of the footprint on the motherboard, to get that, to get reasonably, pretty good graphics performance especially for mobile out of something that's such a small footprint. Yeah, I mean, you let off this point talking about Apple. This is the exact kind of thing that you would end up seeing in like an Apple, computer, Apple laptop, right? Because they always tout the MacBooks, how small they can get the PCB and everything. And now, the only thing left is the storage and the RAM. Everything else is sitting right there, on that package. I kind of joked about on the podcast that all you need is like some Crosspoint and some RAM and some little bit of flash and pile them all on that same PCB, and you literally have everything you need. Everything else is just interconnection and batteries. So it's impressive. Now the counter is, of course, like if your GPU fails, you're not necessarily going to DIY fix this thing, right? You're not going to go on eBay and find some extra board for your laptop and swap it out or try to upgrade after the purchase or anything. This is just what you get is what you get, right? It's all built into a part. It was all done at the factory. You're not changing anything. But at the end of the day, it'll make things smaller, cheaper, lighter, all those things, which of course is where all this computer stuff's going. Yeah, there's a video showing them where all the parts would have to be laid out onto the board of the thing, and if you just combine them all together, you can save a lot of room.
How about that,
you don't
kids?
Yeah. They're using the HBM memory, so it's all the dies are stacked on top of each other off to the side of the GPU, and then on top of that, just the fact that the GPU is right there, parked right next to the CPU.
Right,
it's good stuff. Yeah,
it is interesting. The plot thickens, however, when we look at our next story for the day. Well, not so thick. This isn't the thick part. Hades Canyon Nook with AMD graphics spotted, and the next unit of computing, the new unit of computing, the Nook, the delete expletive Nook, which I've actually only heard once when somebody lost the power supply to it, which I think is really on them and not on the Nook, to be perfectly honest. I will point that out.
Here's what's so great. Here's what's so great about this story. The previous news came out that we just talked about yesterday. On the podcast last night, on the PC Perspective podcast, we were like just speculating back and forth. There was a little bit of back and forth on, do you think they could actually put this in a Nook? Well, there it is. Like I was saying, well, of course they would put one in a Nook. It'd be easier to cool. You have a single heatsink over all of those surfaces at the same time. Yes, it's a little more power output than your typical Nook has, but I mean, we're talking 35 or 40 watts or somewhere around there. And a Nook can dissipate that. Like there have been Nooks, with enough, heat dissipating capability to do that. And look at how compact that is. I mean, that's the CPU and the GPU and the GPU memory, like just sitting right there, right? And you even get to consolidate. You even get to group together. Like notice some of those voltage regulator modules are no doubt for the CPU, and then another bank off to the other side is also for the GPU. You get to shrink things so much, like the effect just builds, right? You're just being so efficient with your PCB space there. I mean, there's more space just for a couple of sticks of RAM and the SSD on that PCB.
You're pretty delighted by this.
Yeah, than all of the processing capability that it needs, right?
Right.
So, cool stuff, right?
I'm not arguing.
Yeah, I know.
And then things got even crazier. Why don't you talk about this one?
I actually don't have all the details myself. I mean, I have the high level stuff, but Raja Koduri was basically, guy in charge of the Radeon Solutions Group. In other words, the group of which came the Vega GPUs that we saw recently launched, right? He took a sabbatical after that launch. No doubt he was kind of spent because, who knows how many late nights in a row that poor guy had done, trying to get that launch and make everything smooth, right? Took a sabbatical, and then during the sabbatical, he said, well, I might not be coming back. And then made that official, followed up almost immediately by, oh, by the way, I'm going to go work at Intel.
At this point, if we were really in an animated movie, the character would be like, Nani?
This I think is why it's good that I'm pretty sure California has outlawed non-competes and stuff like that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Whether you'll be sued into oblivion around that is an entirely different question that I don't know. Answer for.
I don't know. And so we don't know for sure what's going to come of this. But it obviously probably means better things in the graphics department for Intel in the future, right? Like they kind of need help in the whole integrated graphics or just graphics in general thing. Like they've taken stabs at trying to do GPU stuff on their own. Yes. And it's never ended very well for them. I mean, it's ended sort of okay in that they would usually end up with a GPU that they could attach to their processor and call it, be good enough to call it integrated graphics, but never anything that's going to compete with the likes of, discrete graphics. But I mean, they could eventually get there. Don't expect anything overnight, because assuming that there was a team ready to design and build stuff and everything, you're still talking like a couple of years out to have any kind of fruits of this changeover. But I'm pretty sure Intel doesn't even have that kind of a team in place. Raja would probably have to, put that team together under him.
Well, they have a fair amount of engineering talent inside of Intel, and they have a fair amount of graphics talent. Maybe not at the level that he's been operating, but I think the bigger question, I think what it will be interesting to see is if and when any lawsuits start flying, and how that impacts product releases. I mean, if you're going to go to a company, it's always good to go to a company from, company A, which has a lot of lawyers, to company B, which has a lot more lawyers than company A. But this is going to be one of those things where, we've seen this happen with Tesla and a whole bunch of other places. An employee leaves, they have information or knowledge, intellectual property, if you will, and then the company they moved to gets sued by the company they left. This just seems ripe for something like that. Although, everybody at both these companies is pretty smart and probably don't want to spend millions of dollars on lawsuits.
There is also a possibility that this, we don't know for sure, obviously, anything, but think of the other thing that we just talked about happened. So now you have an AMD GPU right next to an Intel CPU on an Intel substrate, all packaged together by Intel. Now you have the AMD GPU guy moving over to Intel. So maybe there's some future even better integration there. Maybe who knows? Who knows where that could go? But times are changing, I guess, is the best thing you could say out of what just happened here, and I'm sure Ryan will try to get him back on. We've had Raja on a live stream before for PC Per, and the bourbon bottle is standing by for him for the next time he's in town.
Bonded whiskey from just a county over.
If you haven't seen that video, it's pretty funny. Even if you're not interested in all of the in-depth technical discussion that took place in that video, there was a break point in the video because our stream went down or something happened, like the streaming computer blue screened. And everybody was about, Ryan was pouring the drinks then. And then the joke we did was when the stream came back, we had took the full bourbon bottle and emptied it into a few big cups. and had the bottle there empty on the table. So when the stream came back, everybody was acting just bent. with the bourbon bottle like empty on its side and everything. It was pretty funny.
Oh man.
But
it boggles the mind. It does.
There it is. There's the empty bourbon bottle. Yep.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thus legends are made. It was a crazy year in hardware, and thank you so much for enjoying the ride with us at twit.tv/Twitch and This Week in Computer Hardware. Ryan Shrout, sir, what are you most looking forward to in 2018 in the hardware world? What's leaping out at you from CES or later?
I need to see consumer HDR gaming displays. That's what I need.
How about, is there even a consumer HDR gaming spec?
No. First things first, man. Iterate.
Keep tuning in to This Week in Computer Hardware, and you'll find out whether or not the first generation of HDR-capable consumer games will work with the consumer monitors that do HDR that are showing up. Although we've seen a whole bunch of computer monitors already that claim they support HDR. They just can't tell us which one. Twit.tv/Twitch is the place to go for more of the episodes and all of our new coverage. And to learn how to subscribe, you can find more Ryan Shrout at PCPer.com. You can find more of me at TEKTHING.com or AVXL.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening or watching and sharing the show with your friends. I'm Patty Norton.
I'm Ryan Shrout.
See you next year, 2018.